The night was alive with the hum of luxury cars pulling up to the grand entrance of the city's most elite VIP club. Glittering lights cascaded down the polished marble facade, casting a glow on the long line of guests dressed in designer suits and shimmering gowns. The air buzzed with quiet arrogance, the kind that came from knowing you belonged to a world carefully guarded against outsiders. Security guards, standing tall and stern, scanned each face not merely for verification, but for silent judgment, as if deciding who was worthy of entry based on appearances alone. Among the line of polished perfection, she appeared. A black woman, dressed simply yet carrying herself with quiet confidence, stepped forward. Her attire lacked the flash of wealth, but there was something composed in her posture, something that did not waver under the scrutiny of sharp eyes. Without hesitation, she approached the entrance, the chatter around her dipping for a moment. As heads turned in silent appraisal, her stride was steady, neither rushed nor hesitant, as though she belonged there, as though the gold-plated doors were just as much for her as for anyone else. But the moment her feet touched the top of the steps, a security guard extended his arm across her path. His face, tight with authority, barely concealed the disdain curling at the edges of his expression. "Members only," he barked, his tone flat but cutting like glass. His gaze swept over her from head to toe, not searching for credentials but assuming their absence. Around them, conversations hushed further, curiosity piqued, amusement brewing. She stood still, unfazed by the barrier in front of her. Her eyes, calm and unblinking, held the guards for a beat longer than expected. She said nothing, yet there was a depth in her silence that carried more weight than 1,000 words. The people in line exchanged knowing glances, some with poorly disguised smirks curling their lips. To them, this was a mistake unfolding in real time, a spectacle of misplaced confidence. The security guard's lip curled slightly as he repeated, louder this time, as if to draw more attention, "This is a private club. You're not on the list." His voice seemed to grow heavier with the anticipation of an audience. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A couple of phones discreetly tilted toward her direction, eager to capture what they assumed would be a quick, humiliating dismissal. Still, she did not flinch. Her gaze drifted, not to the people, not to the cameras, but to the building itself, as if she could see something beneath its surface, as if its walls whispered familiar tales. For a flicker of a second, her fingers moved gently, tracing an absent pattern against her palm, a habit that suggested comfort in uncomfortable moments, or perhaps muscle memory from times long past. The crowd's amusement deepened. A man in line let out a quiet chuckle, nudging his companion, while another raised an eyebrow in exaggerated disbelief. "She really thinks she's getting in," someone whispered just loud enough for the words to travel. But none of it seemed to touch her. She stood as if encased in glass, the noise, the judgment, the laughter sliding off her invisible shield. Another staff member, a manager by the sharpness of his suit and the false polish of his smile, approached briskly. Without even looking at her directly, he leaned toward the guard and whispered, just loud enough for nearby guests to catch fragments of contempt. The guard responded with a laugh lacking all subtlety, shaking his head at the perceived absurdity. Every moment seemed designed to strip her dignity away, to reduce her to nothing more than an outsider, daring to cross a threshold guarded by pride and prejudice. Yet she did not shrink. Her eyes, steady and unwavering, watched them with an expression that felt almost too calm, as if she were observing rather than participating in the scene. As the final blow, the guard gestured firmly for her to leave. Without a word, without casting a single glance back at the crowd that had turned her presence into sport, she lowered her gaze briefly to the ground, then lifted it once more to the grand doors of the club. Her lips pressed into a neutral line. She turned, walking away with the same composed stride with which she had arrived. But as she stepped away from the club, there was an unmistakable undercurrent to her movement, something barely perceptible, yet profoundly felt. It was not the walk of someone defeated. It was the quiet departure of someone who knew their time had not yet arrived, but was inevitable. As she walked away from the club's towering facade, the echoes of quiet laughter and mocking whispers trailed behind her, lingering in the cool night air like a bitter aftertaste. But her shoulders did not drop, nor did her pace falter. Each step she took carried the weight of every sneer she had absorbed without flinching. The door behind her closed with a heavy thud, a final note in their orchestrated humiliation. But she didn't look back. She didn't need to. Their actions had already written themselves into her memory, not as wounds but as fuel. Inside the club, the spectacle of her rejection became a fresh topic of amusement. At the bar, clusters of well-dressed patrons chuckled over overpriced drinks, retelling the incident as though it were the highlight of their evening. "Did you see her face?" one man snorted, shaking his head with an air of mock disbelief. Another chimed in, "She actually thought she belonged here." Unbelievable. Their laughter was shallow, hollow, yet loud enough to matter in a place where reputation was currency. Meanwhile, outside under the soft glow of the streetlights, she paused momentarily beside a parked car, her fingers brushing along its cool surface. Her reflection stared back at her from the glossy paint, poised and unwavering. There was no trace of anger, no visible crack in her composure. If anything, her gaze held a quiet fire, buried deep but burning steadily. For a brief moment her eyes closed, not in defeat, but in focus, as if replaying every slight, not as pain, but as preparation. Back at the entrance, the club's manager, still riding the wave of authority, spoke loudly to the staff gathered nearby. His words were sharp, laced with contempt thinly disguised as policy enforcement. "We have standards to maintain," he declared, scanning the faces of his team, ensuring they mirrored his disdain. The guard who had turned her away chuckled, nodding in agreement, his chest puffed with the false pride of a man who had just flexed his power over the powerless. Yet what none of them noticed was the brief glance she cast at the club's nameplate as she walked away. It was not the look of a woman dismissed, but of someone marking a target with quiet precision. Her eyes lingered on the engraved letters, as though committing them to memory, not out of longing but as part of a larger, hidden calculation. Across the street, a sleek black sedan idled with its engine low and steady. The driver, a sharply dressed man with a discreet earpiece, observed her approach through the tinted windshield. As she opened the door and slid into the back seat, he inclined his head respectfully but said nothing. Inside the car, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The moment the door clicked shut, the air felt different, calm, controlled, purposeful. She pulled out her phone, the screen lighting up to reveal a flurry of unread messages and notifications, none of which showed even a hint of panic. Instead, her eyes scanned a document displayed on the screen, the title bearing the name of the very club that had just turned her away. Her lips curved into the faintest suggestion of a knowing smile, one that didn't reach her eyes but hinted at something quietly unfolding beneath the surface. In the club, the manager continued his display of authority, now recounting the scene to a small group of VIP patrons as though it were a story of triumph. "These types think money can buy class," he scoffed, unaware of the irony dripping from his words. His audience laughed obligingly, toasting to their shared delusions of superiority. They never once considered the possibility that their laughter might be premature. She sat back against the leather seat, her posture relaxed, yet deliberate. Outside the window, the city lights blurred past, neon streaks slicing through the darkness. She wasn't rushing. There was no urgency in her movements, no frantic need to prove herself in the moment. Patience had always been her silent strength, and tonight it cloaked her like invisible armor. As the car pulled into a private driveway, guarded by tall iron gates and flanked by manicured hedges, the driver stepped out to open her door. She emerged with the same poise she had carried all evening, her steps measured, her expression unreadable. Inside the grand residence, a fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting flickering shadows across the polished floors. She walked past, a wall adorned with framed contracts and accolades, her gaze momentarily settling on a photograph of her standing beside a group of influential business leaders. No one at the club had recognized her tonight. No one had seen beyond the surface of her appearance, beyond the simplicity of her dress and the quiet confidence in her eyes. But the walls of her home told a different story. They spoke of boardrooms conquered, of deals brokered in rooms far grander than any nightclub, of respect earned in currencies more valuable than fleeting social approval. Her phone buzzed again, and this time she answered. A brief exchange followed, her words calm, decisive. She ended the call and placed the device down with a finality that felt like the closing of a chapter. In her mind, the night was far from over. There was still a move to make, one she had anticipated the moment she felt the sting of unwarranted dismissal. Her gaze drifted toward the city skyline, lights twinkling like 1,000 watchful eyes. She inhaled deeply, as though drawing strength from the view itself, and exhaled with quiet resolve. The game they thought they had won had only just begun, and she was holding the next move, steady and sure. The next evening arrived without fanfare, yet the city pulsed with its usual rhythm of power and pretense. At the same VIP club, lights once again spilled onto the pavement, casting golden hues over the line of eager patrons waiting to be seen, to be validated by their association with luxury. Inside, the staff moved with habitual sharpness, polishing surfaces that already gleamed and perfecting displays designed to dazzle those desperate for social recognition. None of them noticed the subtle shift in the air, the quiet tension curling beneath the glamour, as if something unspoken was about to unfold. Outside, a black luxury sedan eased to a stop at the curb, its polished exterior reflecting the club's name in perfect clarity. The doorman, recognizing the vehicle's understated opulence, straightened his posture instinctively. Moments later, the rear door opened, and she stepped out, her presence commanding immediate attention. This time, her attire spoke differently. Not loud or ostentatious, but crafted with an elegance that whispered power rather than shouted it. Her gaze, calm and steady, swept the entrance as if surveying a property she already owned. The security guard who had denied her entry the night before stiffened visibly. His jaw tightened, though he tried to mask his discomfort behind a thin veil of professionalism. His eyes darted toward the club manager, silently pleading for guidance. But the manager himself had noticed the subtle convoy behind her. Two sleek vehicles carrying sharply dressed individuals, stepping out with quiet authority, each holding portfolios and documents of significance. She advanced with the same poised steps, unhurried and unbothered by the stir of whispers blooming around her. The crowd, sensing something unusual, instinctively pulled out their phones once more, but this time the lenses captured not a moment of humiliation, but a spectacle of intrigue. The same people who had laughed a night earlier now watched in growing silence, their smirks fading into uncertain curiosity. Without waiting for permission, she crossed the threshold where she had been stopped before. The security guard, unsure whether to intervene, hesitated fatally. The club manager stepped forward, his forced smile brittle at the edges. "Ma'am, this is a private establishment," he began, but the words felt hollow in the face of the confidence radiating from her presence. Before he could continue, one of her associates produced a folded document, crisp and official, and held it up for inspection. The manager's eyes narrowed as he took it, scanning the header, and then freezing as recognition dawned. The document bore the unmistakable seal of ownership transfer, complete with signatures and legal confirmations. His mouth opened slightly, but no words emerged. A quiet ripple passed through the gathered staff and patrons alike. Eyes widened, jaws slackened, and the once dismissive atmosphere cracked under the weight of realization. She was no mere hopeful. guest trying to enter their gilded circle. She was now the owner of the very place they had thought above her reach. Maintaining her composure, she met the manager's stunned gaze with a calm that was almost gentle. There was no triumph flashing in her eyes, no trace of gloating or arrogance. She simply stood there as the embodiment of quiet power, as if to remind them all that true authority requires no loud declaration. The manager, fumbling for professionalism, forced to swallow and gestured weakly toward the entrance. "Welcome," he managed to say, the word catching in his throat. Around them, whispers turned into hurried conversations, speculations swirling through the air like a gathering storm. Phones captured every second, live streams already filling social media feeds with astonished commentary. She moved past him without a word, stepping into the lavish interior of the club. The atmosphere inside shifted palpably, like the change in pressure before a summer thunderstorm. Patrons who had dismissed her only hours before now stood aside, their expressions a mixture of embarrassment and awe. Some attempted polite nods, shallow attempts at grace under pressure, but she neither acknowledged nor responded. She didn't need to. The truth of her position had already spoken louder than any exchange of pleasantries. Her associates followed closely, their presence reinforcing the gravity of the moment. They began a quiet, methodical survey of the premises, their eyes scanning architectural details, guest lists, staffing patterns, every element of the club now under her dominion. Staff scrambled to adjust their demeanor, replacing earlier condescension with clumsy attempts at deference. She walked the length of the main hall, her fingers lightly brushing the polished surfaces, not out of admiration, but as if reacquainting herself with something that rightfully belonged to her. Every step was a silent assertion of control, every glance a quiet statement of claim. There was no need for her to speak, no necessity for grand gestures. Her presence alone redefined the entire narrative of the place. As she reached the center of the room, the manager hovered nearby, still clutching the document as though it might vanish and release him from his unfolding nightmare. She let him wait in his discomfort, not out of cruelty but because the moment deserved its full weight. The onlookers, too, remained suspended in a collective breath, witnessing a reversal so profound it seemed almost unreal. But it was real. Unmistakably, irrevocably real. She was the owner now, and they were merely players in a scene they had thought they controlled. The balance of power had shifted so naturally, so seamlessly, that they could scarcely believe how swiftly their world had tilted beneath them. The room, once filled with self-assured chatter, now held a heavy silence, save for the faint sounds of cameras clicking and videos recording the moment history was being made, one poised step at a time. The weight of the moment settled over the club like an invisible fog, thick with unspoken reckoning. Eyes that had once gazed at her with dismissal now followed her every move, uncertain and uneasy. But she carried herself with the same quiet grace, as though none of their earlier scorn had touched her at all. There was no triumph in her stride, no smirk of revenge dancing at the corners of her lips. She walked with dignity, a posture of calm authority that made their earlier arrogance feel small and childish. Staff members scrambled to adjust, some straightening uniforms, others lowering their eyes, aware that their actions had already written their place in this unfolding story. The manager, still holding the ownership documents with stiff fingers, cleared his throat awkwardly, struggling to regain a semblance of control. But control had slipped from his grasp long before he realized it. Now all that remained was to face the consequences that had arrived not in fury, but in quiet. Inescapable justice. She paused at the grand bar, her gaze sweeping across the polished counter where, only a night before, her rejection had been retold as amusement over cocktails. The bartender, recognizing her attention, averted his eyes and busied himself with rearranging bottles that were already perfectly aligned. His hands trembled slightly, betraying the anxiety simmering beneath his professional facade. Her associates moved methodically through the room, speaking in low tones, To the legal representatives who had accompanied her, contracts were reviewed, operational records examined, and the management hierarchy quietly assessed. The process was clinical, efficient, devoid of theatrics, yet it carried the weight of irreversible change. Every signature on every paper they held was a silent declaration that the era of exclusion had ended. The club's staff gathered uneasily, sensing the shift but unsure of their fate. Without raising her voice, she addressed them, her tone steady and clear. She spoke not of vengeance or retribution, but of standards, of integrity, and of the culture she intended to build under her ownership. Her words were simple, but they carried the undeniable strength of conviction. She reminded them that respect was not a courtesy reserved for a select few, but a principle to be upheld unconditionally. There was no need to call out the security guard who had blocked her path, nor the manager who had patronized her. The consequences were already unfolding, as naturally as dawn follows night. Their positions, once secure in the hierarchy of exclusion, now hung precariously in the balance of merit and accountability. Her leadership did not require public humiliation to assert itself. The truth of her ownership and her vision for change were more powerful than any rebuke. As her message concluded, there was a silence heavy with realization. The staff stood straighter, not out of fear, but out of a dawning respect for the woman, who had risen above their narrow judgments. She offered no indulgence for empty apologies, no time for excuses rooted in ignorance. What had passed could not be undone, but what lay ahead would be shaped by the lessons of this moment. In the crowd of patrons, some attempted weak smiles of familiarity, as if to erase their earlier contempt with forced friendliness. She acknowledged none of them. Her focus remained forward, on the transformation of the space now under her command. The club would no longer be a monument to shallow exclusivity. It would become a symbol of renewal, of earned prestige, and of open doors for those who carried themselves with purpose and respect, regardless of appearance. The manager, sensing the inevitable, stepped aside and relinquished his authority without protest. His earlier bravado had crumbled under the weight of his own prejudice. There was no spectacle in his departure, no public announcement. He simply faded from relevance, eclipsed by the quiet strength of her presence and the undeniable finality of her ownership. Her team continued their evaluation, making swift yet thoughtful decisions about the future leadership of the club. New roles were assigned based on competence and character, not convenience or bias. The staff, once complicit in exclusion, now found themselves part of a space being reborn. The message was clear. This was no longer a place where assumptions dictated actions. It was a place where every individual would be seen for their merit, not their image. Throughout the evening, as the club's heartbeat adjusted to its new rhythm, she remained a constant, graceful force. She did not revel in the discomfort of those who had wronged her. There was no need. The true satisfaction lay in the creation of something greater than revenge, a lasting change that would outlive the fleeting moments of humiliation she had endured. Patrons departed quietly, some reflecting on their own complicity in the earlier mockery, others carrying away a story they would retell with reluctant admiration. Word of the transformation spread beyond the walls of the club, carried by whispers and social media posts alike. The narrative had shifted irrevocably, from exclusion to empowerment, from judgment to justice. She stood beneath the grand chandelier, its crystal facets casting prisms of light across the room, her gaze steady and her mind already moving beyond the night's events. This was not an ending, but a beginning. A quiet, powerful revolution had taken place, not with noise or spectacle, but with unwavering dignity. The story of the woman they had tried to exclude would not fade into the background. It would become part of the club's legacy, an unspoken reminder etched into its very foundation. The lesson lingered in the air long after the final guest had gone. True power needs no permission, and justice, when it arrives, speaks softly but leaves a permanent echo. Long after the last glass had been cleared from the polished counters and the final traces of the night's commotion had faded, she remained in the quiet of the club, walking its corridors with a thoughtful calm. The once bustling space, now emptied of noise and pretense, seemed to breathe differently under her quiet authority. Her footsteps were unhurried, her eyes absorbing every detail, not as a stranger but as someone returning to a place that had unknowingly waited for her all along. Where once there had been laughter at her expense, there was now only reflection and the silent weight of lessons freshly learned. Her gaze drifted to the walls where grand portraits of past owners hung, there, frames heavy with history. These faces, once symbols of exclusivity and separation, now seemed oddly hollow. She regarded them not with resentment, but with a quiet acknowledgement of the path that had led her here. Their time had passed, their legacies overshadowed not by scandal or disgrace, but by the arrival of something far more enduring, the quiet triumph of dignity over prejudice. The staff, though dispersed for the evening, would return to a new reality, one shaped not by fear or favoritism, but by respect and accountability. She had made her intentions clear not through threats, but through action, by standing unshaken, in the face of disrespect and responding not with retaliation, but with transformation. She understood that true change was not about removing people from their positions in anger, but about removing the rot that had allowed such narrowness to take root in the first place. Outside the grand windows, the city lights sparkled, unaware of the quiet revolution that had unfolded within these walls. Yet beyond the shimmering facades of neighboring buildings, stories were already spreading. People talked of the woman who had turned rejection into ownership, who had faced down snobbery with unbreakable poise. Strangers, who had never set foot inside this club, felt a shift, as if her victory had rippled outward, touching even those who had never known her name. She approached the main entrance, pausing at the spot where the guard had once blocked her path. For a moment she stood there, allowing herself to feel the weight of that memory, not with bitterness, but with quiet pride. It was not the humiliation that stayed with her now, but the clarity it had given her. She had been tested, not by the hostility of others, but by her own ability to remain true to herself in the face of it. As her eyes settled on the door frame, she thought of every person who had ever felt the sting of exclusion, who had ever been measured by the shallow yardsticks of appearance or assumption. She thought of those who had been silenced not by rules, but by the invisible chains of judgment. And in that moment, she understood that her victory was never just her own. It was a statement, quiet but profound, that the walls others build to keep you out can become the very structures you own. She turned from the doorway and crossed the marble floor to a small side table, where a guest book rested beneath a crystal lamp. Picking up the pen, she opened the book to a fresh page. Without fanfare, she wrote a few words, her handwriting elegant yet strong. She did not sign her name at the end, because this message was not a declaration of her identity, but a reflection of her journey. She wrote not for herself, but for every person who would walk through these doors in the future, seeking not validation, but respect. Her words, simple yet resonant, captured the heart of her transformation. Let no one here be judged by the surface they wear, but by the spirit they carry within. She closed the book softly and left it open on the table, a silent invitation for anyone who entered this space to read and remember. The club, once a fortress of exclusion, had become a sanctuary of possibility. It would no longer serve as a stage for shallow performances of wealth and status, but as a platform where genuine connection and earned respect took precedence. This was not merely about changing a policy or replacing a few faces. It was about dismantling an entire mindset, brick by brick, with patience and unwavering resolve. She walked toward the grand staircase that overlooked the main hall, her eyes scanning the space as if seeing it not for what it had been, but for what it could now become. In her mind, She saw future gatherings filled with laughter that did not sting, with conversations that built bridges instead of walls. She saw diversity not as decoration, but as the fabric of something authentic and enduring. Her steps carried her to the balcony, where she paused to take in the full view of the club below. The emptiness of the room did not feel hollow, but full of potential, as though it was waiting for the new stories that would soon unfold within its walls. She allowed herself a quiet breath, a moment of stillness, before turning her gaze outward, toward the city skyline once more. There, on the horizon, the first light of dawn teased the edges of the night sky, casting a soft glow that promised renewal. The timing felt poetic, though she had not planned it. It was as if the world itself was acknowledging the close of one chapter and the beginning of another. She embraced the moment without words, knowing that some victories were best savored in silence. In the distance, the club's old patrons would wake to headlines and conversations they could not escape. They would read of her quiet triumph, of the shift that had taken place without noise or spectacle. Some would feel the sting of regret, others the burn of embarrassment, but perhaps, if they allowed it, they would also feel the spark of change within themselves. She descended the staircase, her pace steady and sure, her heart unburdened by the weight of proving anything to anyone. She had already proven it to herself, and that was more than enough. The future of this place would carry her imprint, not as a mark of ownership alone, but as a legacy of what is possible when dignity refuses to be diminished by narrow minds. As she crossed the threshold one final time that night, stepping into the early light of a new day, she felt no need to look back. The club stood behind her, transformed not by force, but by the quiet strength of her will. In her chest, there was no triumphal drumbeat, only the steady rhythm of clarity and peace. And in that final moment, as the city slowly awoke, she disappeared into the dawn, leaving behind not just a building reclaimed, but a lesson written into its very walls, a reminder to all who passed through that respect, once given freely, has the power to change everything.